The pepper sacks have sat on the dock for 11 days, and still the wind will not turn. A young deckhand leans against the hull of a becalmed ship, listening for the change in the air that will finally let them sail. It is the year 1300, on a stretch of coast the Arab and Persian sailors filling this harbour call Kollam, and which a Venetian merchant who passed through 7 years earlier wrote down as Kollam. Today it sits in the Indian state of Kerala, on the southwestern tip of the subcontinent, the Arabian Sea on one side and the green wall of the Western Ghats on the other. That Venetian merchant, his name was Marco Polo, and he came through in 1293, escorting a Mongol princess to her wedding in Persia, wrote that ships gathered here from half the known world, and that everyone who traded here, buying as much as they sold, went home wealthier than they arrived. He was not exaggerating for effect. He did not need to. Most of this coastline offers ships nothing. Arab geographers who sailed it for centuries complained, again and again, that Malabar had no real harbours, just an open shore, exposed straight to the Arabian Sea, with nowhere to hide when the monsoon turned violent. This port is the exception, and the reason is written into the shape of the land itself. Behind the beach sits a wide, sheltered lagoon, its mud flats forming natural anchorage where a storm-driven sea can't reach. Ships that would be smashed to pieces on the open coast a day's sail in either direction ride out the worst weather here, tucked behind a spit of land the ocean cannot touch. That is the entire reason this town exists as something more than a fishing village. Geography built this harbour before anyone else did. So it fills, every year, with people who have no other reason to stand in the same square. Arab traders whose grandfathers first sailed down from the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, from Hormuz, from Aden, from Cairo, and never entirely left, marrying into families here for so many generations that their children's children are simply local now, neither one people nor the other, but their own. Chinese merchants, whom Marco Polo's own account calls by the name Southern Chinese traders, were known by in his day. Manzi, anchored in ships unlike anything the Arab shipwrights build. Persians, men from further up the Mediterranean whom Polo simply calls the Levant, because there is no more specific word for how far some of these journeys stretch. On any given evening, more languages are spoken within sight of this harbour than most people alive today will hear in a lifetime. The young deckhand has grown up around all of it without ever once finding it strange. He couldn't tell you which language the Chinese sailors 2 berths down are speaking to each other, only that he recognizes the shape of it, the way you recognize a neighbor's voice through a wall without making out the words. He knows the smell of the dye seller's stalls from the smell of the one selling dried fish, knows which merchants haggle in good humor and which ones don't, knows exactly how many days a coconut rope hull needs recalking before its captain starts to worry out loud. None of this is knowledge he ever sat down to learn. It simply accumulated the way harbor knowledge always does, one ordinary day at a time. His own ship is built the way every ship on this coast is built, which is to say, without a single iron nail. The planks are bored through with small holes, edge to edge, and laced together with rope twisted from coconut fiber, coir, pulled tight, corked, pulled tight again, until the hull holds itself together the way a woven basket holds its shape, not the way a nailed box does. Foreign travelers who see this method for the first time tend to assume it is a poorer or more primitive way of building a ship. It is neither. It is a design suited exactly to what this coast can supply in abundance and what it lacks. Coconut trees everywhere, and no local source of iron worth the cost of importing at this scale. A sewn hull also flexes where a nailed one would crack, which matters more than it sounds like it should when a ship is thrown against a reef in high swell. This method will still be in use on this same coast 200 years from now, when Portuguese sailors arrive and write home, half admiring and half alarmed, that the ships here have no metal in them at all. 2 berths down, the Chinese ships make the deckhand's own vessel look almost delicate by comparison. Larger, several-masted, built with a rudder hung off the stern instead of a steering oar over the side, and, though he has never seen inside one and wouldn't know to ask, divided below decks into separate sealed compartments so that a single leak floods one chamber and not the whole ship. None of the sailors on this dock would put it in those terms, but what they are looking at, without quite realizing it, is 2 entirely different answers to the same problem, arrived at on opposite sides of an ocean, both good enough to cross it. The man the deckhand answers to is called, in the language of business that runs this whole coast regardless of whose mother tongue it started in, a Nakhoda, a word borrowed from Persian, meaning something close to ship's master, part captain and part owner, the man whose judgment the whole voyage rests on. A Nakhoda does not need to be Persian himself, or Arab, or anything in particular. The title travels with the trade, used the same way from the Gulf to this harbour to ports further east that the deckhand has heard of only as names. His own Nakhoda has made this crossing more times than the boy has been alive to count, And it shows less in anything he says than in what he doesn't bother saying. He has stopped explaining the obvious to his crew. He simply watches the sky. What they are all waiting for is not a mystery, and it is not bad luck either. It has a season, and everyone on this dock, whatever language they curse in, knows exactly what it is. Twice a year, the wind across this stretch of ocean reverses itself entirely. From roughly late May, a wind blows in from the southwest, carrying ships up from the Gulf and the Red Sea and the East African coast to India. The very wind that carried this year's Arab and Persian ships into harbor months ago. Then, from around late October into the new year, the wind reverses and blows from the northeast instead, and that is the wind that will carry all of them home again, back across the same water they arrived on, in the opposite direction. Between those two winds, for a stretch of days or sometimes weeks, the sky does neither. The old wind has died. The new one has not yet decided to arrive. Ships sit. This is that stretch of days, and everyone on this coast has a word for it, though none of the words translate into anything more poetic than in between. There is nothing to do about it except exactly what the deckhand is doing right now, standing near the hull, feeling for a change in the air that hasn't come yet. His Nakhoda has told him, more than once and without much patience the first time, that the in-between wind isn't a delay, it's a hinge. The whole trading year on this coast is built around it, has been built around it for longer than anyone currently alive can remember learning. You do not fight it. You do not pretend you can outguess it. You wait, and you make sure that when it finally turns, everything is ready to move within the hour, because the ships that hesitate once the wind sets in lose their place in the season entirely, and a season lost on this coast is not made up later. There is only one window each way, and it does not wait for anyone who wasn't ready. Which is why the sacks are already sitting on the dock, tied and stacked, 11 days ahead of the wind that will finally let them move. The pepper inside them, black pepper, the vine that grows up into the hills behind this harbor and nowhere the trading ships have found in anything like this quantity, was picked only a few weeks ago, at the very start of this year's harvest, and laid out in the sun for the better part of a week until the berries dried down hard and dark. That is the whole of the process. Pick, dry, sack, wait. There is nothing else to it, and there does not need to be, because what makes this cargo valuable was never the difficulty of producing it here. It is the distance between here and everywhere that wants it. Here is the part almost everyone gets wrong, centuries later, when this story gets retold. That pepper, sack for sack, was worth its weight in gold. It wasn't, not literally, and any honest accounting of the actual prices involved will tell you so. What was true enough to explain everything happening on this dock right now, is the gap. A sack of pepper here, at the source, costs a fraction of what the same sack will fetch by the time it has passed through a dozen hands, a half-dozen ports, and 2 or 3 seas to reach a kitchen in Cairo or Venice or further north still. Nobody on this dock is getting rich by selling pepper for what it's worth. They are getting rich by selling it to someone who has no way of getting it themselves, at the far end of a chain so long that most of the people paying for it at the end will never learn where it began. Centuries from now, this same spice will show up in European households not just as seasoning but as something closer to money itself, used to pay rent, folded into a daughter's dowry, counted out to settle a debt. Because it is small, it does not spoil, and everyone agrees it is worth something. That reputation is being earned, sack by sack, on docks exactly like this one. There is no single king who rules all of this. That is worth saying plainly, because it is easy to imagine a port this wealthy sitting inside some grand unified kingdom, and that isn't what 1300 looks like here. The old order that once held this coast together has long since broken into smaller pieces, separate lords controlling separate stretches of coastline, this harbour answering to one line of local rulers, a rising port some distance up the coast answering to another that has not yet grown into the name history will later remember it by. None of that fragmentation seems to trouble the trade much. The merchants do not need one king. They need a safe lagoon, a fair customs house, and a wind that turns on schedule. Kollam has reliably supplied the first two for as long as anyone here can say, which is precisely why it does not need to wait on the third from anyone but the sky. The deckhand has heard it said, by whom, exactly, he couldn't tell you, only that it's the kind of thing older sailors say to younger ones without expecting to be questioned, that ships have started arriving from the Gulf carrying something stranger than spice going the other way, horses. Not cargo grown or made anywhere nearby, but animals, walked up a gangplank still spooked from weeks at sea, unloaded onto a dock that smells of nothing they recognize, and led off toward inland kingdoms that breed no warhorses of their own and will pay heavily for ones that survive the crossing. It is a trade that will grow into something enormous in the centuries just ahead of this one. Right now, on this particular dock, it is still closer to a rumor made real only a few times a season. Proof, if anyone needed it, that the ships arriving here don't only carry things away, they bring the rest of the world in, too. 11 days is not, in truth, very long, not by the standards of men who have done this crossing a dozen times and sat through worse waits than this one. But 11 days standing next to cargo that cannot be sold, cannot be moved, and cannot do anything but sit exactly where it is until the sky changes its mind. That has its own particular weight, whether you're 19 years old and new to it or 40 and long since past being surprised by it. The deckhand has learned, these past 11 days, to read the water in the lagoon the way his Nakhoda reads the whole sky. The smallest catch in the surface, a ripple arriving from a slightly different angle than yesterday's, might mean nothing at all, or might mean everything. He has been wrong 4 times already this week. He checks anyway. Everyone on this dock checks anyway. It is the only work available to do until the real work can start again. And then, on some morning that nobody can predict in advance and everybody recognizes the moment it happens, it turns. Not gradually, that is the strange part, the part every Nakhoda on this coast has told every new hand at least once, usually the first time it happens in front of them. The air simply changes direction, the way a held breath finally lets go, and within the hour the whole dock is moving. Sacks lifted, ropes cast off, ships that spent 11 idle days suddenly crowded with more urgency than the boy has seen since they first sailed in. The Nakhoda does not celebrate. He has done this enough times that the wind turning is not a surprise so much as a debt finally being paid. He simply gives the order, and the ship that has sat still for 11 days is moving again within the hour, carrying this year's first dried pepper out past the lagoon mouth, out past the mudflats that make this harbor possible at all, into open water, riding a wind that will not fail them now that it has finally agreed to blow. Nobody today knows this particular deckhand's name, or his Nakhoda's, or whether this exact ship carried this exact cargo on this exact turn of the season. No single record says so, because no one back then thought an ordinary sailing was worth writing down. It happened every single year, on this same coast, to ships very much like this one, for centuries on either side of 1300. What the evidence does show, plainly, is the pattern underneath the story. A port built by the shape of its own coastline, a trade run entirely on the patience of people who understood a wind they could not control and would not try to, and cargo that turned an ordinary harvest into something the whole known world eventually wanted a share of. 800 years later, most of us have never waited on a monsoon. But almost everyone alive today knows exactly what it feels like to have everything ready, nothing left to do, and no choice at all but to wait for something bigger than you to finally turn.